Betty was the wife of William Bardell. She had two wonderful daughters. She was a loving grandmother, great sister. Mrs. Bardell was a nurse at Huron Medical Center, which was only about a half a mile away from where she lived. Betty Bardell loved to sew, and that was what she was doing on September 2nd, 1997, when the defendant broke into her house, shot and killed her in the back room where she was sewing. Now, as the court has already pointed out, in 2012, the United States Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama held life without parole for individuals under the age of 18 that were convicted of first-degree murder was unconstitutional. Had the defendant been 18, we would not be here today. The Supreme Court ruling only involves those cases involving murder. We're not talking about other types of crimes. But for the Bardell family, this has been, just with the Miller decision, a reopening of a wound that we were trying to have healed. In my discussions with Leah Bardell, that was one of the things that she had commented on. And she said it's like pulling a Band-Aid off an open wound and opening up all those old memories, all those old hurts again, having to go through this. Now, the argument from the defense in the brief, even here today, is that the defendant should be given the minimum sentence of 25 years because he was a juvenile at the time of the murder. And I would argue that's already taken into account, his age, by the Supreme Court ruling and allowing him to be resentenced. It's taken into account. The defense is asking you to look at that twice, allowing him to be resentenced, but also taking into account that he was younger. And I would argue that the focus should be here, not on the age of him, because that is already taken into account, but let's look at the facts. Let's look at the defendant's conduct since September 2nd of 1997, when he killed Mrs. Bardell. Looking at those underlying facts, back September 2nd, 1997, Mrs. Bardell was in the safety of her own home, sitting in the back, sewing. Earlier that day, she'd had lunch with her husband, who come home every day at lunchtime from work. And Mr. Bardell would have lunch with his wife and then leave and go back to work and then come home somewhere around 5 o'clock. And he had lunch with his wife that day and left. Now, it should be noted that the defendant on that date was scheduled to be in the family court here for a hearing at the courthouse. He wasn't here though. Instead, the defendant was out breaking into the Bardell home to steal. From the testimony at trial, the defendant had rummaged through Mrs. Bardell's purse that was in the entryway, and then looking through the cabinetry there, he found this Colt revolver that Mr. Bardell had. And Mr. Bardell said the ammunition was kept separate. So the defendant made the conscious effort of taking that ammunition, loading it into that firearm that he had just taken from the cabinet. Now, he could have left at that point. He could have left. He stole some items, he could have left, but he didn't. What did he do? He made the conscious decision to walk through Mrs. Bardell's home with that gun. And then the defendant finds Mrs. Bardell in the back room sewing. And she asked him, what's he doing there? And then she said she was going to call the police. The defendant's response was he said no, and he shoots Mrs. Bardell in the upper shoulder area. Mrs. Bardell, as Leah had commented, struggled to the living room to get to the phone to call for help. She never made it. So what did the defendant do? Well, the argument here is he's scared, he's young, but I say let's look at what he does and what he says. The defendant could have called for help. Did he? No. Dr. Varani, the pathologist, testified during the course of the trial that Mrs. Bardell's injuries could have been survivable if she received immediate medical attention. And mind you, she's very close to the hospital to begin with. The defendant could have called, even if he left, he could have called somebody to come for help, but he didn't. She was left there to die. The defense has argued that this is an accident by a person who was scared and panicked. And surely then, the people who saw the defendant after this murder would have seen a scared young man. But this was not the case. Testimony from his friends at trial was about how he acted and what he said. David Lovis, the defendant was acting calm when he was talking to him. He said he shot a lady with a gun he had. The Defendant said he shot and killed a lady as he was going through her house. Defendant didn't seem to be bothered when he said he shot the lady. Nicole Van Orden had testified. The defendant was acting very cool and calm when he said that he had killed someone. Defendant said he needed the gun for protection from the cops, and if he was going to go down, he was going to go down with a gun. Defendant didn't feel bad about the shooting. Christina Shepard, she said that when the defendant said he shot a lady, and he said, if you don't believe me, I could take you to the house to prove it. Mike McCarty, defendant was calm when he said he shot the woman in the sewing room. And probably just as chilling, Dustin Steer. Dustin testified the defendant broke into the house where he shot a woman. It wasn't like the movies where the blood sprays out, it just kind of flows. The defendant said he was going to shoot her a second time to make sure she was dead, but he couldn't. So his conduct right after that would not, we would submit on behalf of people, show that somebody was scared or panicky. Surely, while the case was pending, there must have been some type of actions to show that. Well, we know from the pre-sentence report that he didn't show remorse when he was writing letters from the juvenile detention facility. And those are documented in the pre-sentence report, the very first pre-sentence report, when he wrote, and this is the quote out of the pre-sentence report, in the letters the defendant referred to how he was not afraid of anyone, and he knows that they are not bulletproof. He goes around saying there's a war going against the cops and weak punk gangs that they join in. He refers to himself as a warlord, and no one could stop him on the streets, especially in Bad X. He is the only one in Bad X that's willing to carry a gun. Defendants in his sentencing brief had included a letter that he sent to, that he wrote but did not send to Ms. Bardell. And that is Exhibit 9 in the sentencing brief about what he wrote at the time. This was purported to be back early on when he was sentenced to prison. I've read that letter, and I asked the court to take note of it as well, because I don't see anywhere in there in which the defendant said he was sorry about what he had done. So then we look forward. Okay, let's look at what was his conduct when he's in prison. Once again, more of the same. Defendant had several write-ups for disobeying orders, being out of bounds, interference with administrative rules, theft, destruction of prisoner property, and possession of weapons while he's in prison.